Okay, good morning, everyone. There's a possibility that people will continue to come in, as is often the way with ODI meetings.
As long as they don't leave.
Yes. Well, we lock the doors once they're in. Welcome, everyone, to this Monday morning event in ODI. ODI, as many of you will know, is an independent policy think tank focusing on international development and humanitarian issues. And periodically, we host a number of policy perspectives from across the political spectrum, here within the UK and more broadly. And we're delighted this morning to have Andrew Mitchell, Shadow International Development Secretary, and some of his international development team here with us to give us a particular perspective from the Conservative Party on their thinking about climate change and international development. And as we go into the countdown to the Copenhagen meetings in December, this issue, of course, has gained a considerable urgency within the international community. But I must admit, I was personally dismayed to see an opinion poll reported in the press over the last couple of weeks to show that here within the UK, there is a certain amount of scepticism about the underlying causes and implications of this agenda. A worrying trend, perhaps. But certainly for developing economies, this is a very real and present issue. And we look forward, Andrew, very much to hearing from you your particular perspective on how this set of issues would be dealt with in the event that we have a change of government next year. Andrew, over to you. But first, before I do that, there's a format I'd like just to communicate with you. Andrew will speak for about 25 to 30 minutes, outlining the main points. Then there'll be maybe 2 or 3 questions from the floor that Andrew will take formally. And then we will break for an informal discussion over coffee. We'll be providing coffee in the room next door for you to be able to talk offline with Andrew and his international development team, who'll be able to stay around for about 20 minutes or so. So I do suggest you take that opportunity. This meeting this morning is being streamed live on the internet and therefore is on the record. Andrew, you're very welcome. Over to you.
Well, Alison, I'd like, first of all, to thank the Overseas Development Institute for their kind invitation to speak here today. You and I, Alison, met some years ago when you very kindly came with me and my team to Copenhagen to look at independent evaluation. Since that time, we have worked closely together, and we hope very much to continue to work closely with ODI in the future. Ladies and gentlemen, in recent years, the world has become less stable and more dangerous. Over the past few years, the world has woken up to the imminent threat of climate change and the need to reduce carbon emissions to the atmosphere. The science is clear. The threats to our planet are unprecedented, and within our lifetime, the consequences could be catastrophic. Already, the facts are moving faster than our willingness to act. Climate change is already part of the daily lives of poor people around the world. But if we take action, it is still doable to ensure a maximum global temperature rise of only 2 degrees centigrade and protect humanity against the worst consequences of climate change. This week, as the countdown to the Copenhagen conference enters single figures, which Alison referred to, some of my colleagues in the Shadow Cabinet will deliver speeches on different aspects of climate change, reaffirming the Conservative Party's commitment to the issue. Tomorrow, George Osborne, the Shadow Chancellor, will speak. On Wednesday, William Hague, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, will speak to the Green Alliance. And later in the week, Greg Clark, the Shadow Climate Change Secretary, will be making a speech as well. In this, the first speech in the series, I will argue that climate change is not just an environmental issue. It is also one of international social justice. Because a problem caused overwhelmingly by the developed world is having its earliest and most deadly impact on the developing world. Those that can least take the pain are being hit first and hit hardest. It is a matter of morality, responsibility, and simple justice that we put their interests first at Copenhagen. Specifically, I want to make 6 key points. First, that any deal must aim to keep temperature rises down to a maximum of 2 degrees. Second, that any deal must be consistent with the interest of the world's poorest countries. Third, that environmental considerations are absolutely central to my party's drive for effectiveness and value for money in British aid. Fourth, that we must end the use of the Export Credit Guarantee Department to promote dirty fossil fuel power stations around the world and instead make it a champion of green technology. Fifth, that a Copenhagen deal must make global fossil fuel subsidy reform a priority. And sixth, that rich countries must take steps to help give poor countries a bigger voice in global climate negotiations. Now let me take each of these in turn. First, how big a cut in emissions is big enough? The latest science demands a cut of 40% by 2020 from developed countries if we are to hold the rise in global temperatures to less than 2 degrees. Anything above 2 degrees, and we will be heading into dangerous territory. The balance of commitments entered into by the developed and developing worlds must be a fair reflection of each country's capacity to contribute to emissions reductions and of their historical contribution to the problem. The litmus test as to whether a deal is a success or not is simple. Will it keep global warming to 2 degrees? If the deal on the table doesn't look like it is going to do this, then the British delegation must have the nerve to reject the usual backslapping and face-saving statements and to stand up and say, no, this is not good enough. The summit in Copenhagen is a historic opportunity for the world to take bold collective action to deal with the looming menace of climate change. We want to see, indeed the whole world wants to see, an ambitious global deal to limit emissions and make available substantial financial resources for adaptation and mitigation. The international community needs to come together to agree a deal that is fair for the developing world. As Greg Clark has made clear, binding global mechanisms are by far the best way to lock in international adaptation and mitigation commitments. No deal at Copenhagen should be regarded as serious unless it finds an international mechanism to help people in the world's poorest countries protect themselves against future floods, famine, and drought, in addition to what is needed to help relieve their current poverty. We need to ensure that our entire approach to development is consistent with our commitment to environmental sustainability. That is the best way to help people in the world's poorest countries protect themselves against future floods, famine, and drought, while stimulating growth and trade. It is simple common sense that using aid effectively to reduce poverty around the world requires a smart approach to the effects of climate change. If we win the election next year, our top priority will be to make British aid as effective as possible in reducing poverty. Much of DFID's aid is amazingly effective. Just look at our funding for the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunisation, which has saved the lives of at least an estimated 3.5 million people since 2001. This is something of which every British taxpayer can be incredibly proud, and I just wish the current government would do a better job of highlighting and celebrating successes like this. Our own commitment to spending 0.7% of national income as aid by 2013 was made in 2005, a time of relative prosperity. We've stuck by it through this time of crisis, and we will honour it if we are elected. We've stuck by it because it is the right thing to do, and because it is profoundly in Britain's long-term national interest. But the quality of aid matters just as much as the quantity of it. In our Green Paper earlier this year, of which we have copies here for anyone who hasn't yet seen it, we set out some of the steps we will take to ensure aid is more effective. An independent aid watchdog to provide evidence about the impact of British aid on the lives of poor people around the world. So we know what works and what doesn't, allowing us to base future spending decisions on evidence, not guesswork. Results-based aid, linking aid payments to actual achievements on the ground, not simply to vague promises of action and impressive-sounding strategy documents. Tough scrutiny of multilateral agencies, giving more money to those that reduce poverty effectively, and unapologetically cutting or even abolishing funding for those that are letting poor people down. Our priority, even our obsession, will be value for money and effectiveness. And it is in this vein that we will approach all of DFID's aid in a climate-smart manner. For climate change is a fact of life that will both affect and be affected by international development policy across the board. If we want effectively to promote gender equality and empower women, then there is no greater challenge than giving women the tools and the voice to deal with the changing climate where they are on the front line. As the United Nations Population Fund reported last week, societies where women have more say over their own lives and have access to education, healthcare, and legal protection will be more resilient to both ongoing and sudden weather-related disasters. If we want effectively to promote long-term sustainable agriculture, an area which DFID has sadly neglected in recent years, then we must ensure the support we give to farmers takes account of changing rainfall and unpredictable seasons. We must promote crops that are suitable to the changed and changing circumstances, and we must support research into technology that gives farmers up-to-date, usable weather information at their fingertips. If we want effectively to tackle HIV/AIDS, then we must know that any treatment we support must be complemented by food security. Households living with HIV/AIDS are often already on the margins of society and struggle to ensure they have the food and the livelihood to keep going. When changing weather patterns threaten food security, that whole fight gets harder. And if we want effectively to address conflict, the enemy of development, then we must recognize the intersection between a growing population and increasingly scarce resources. In Niger, the population has risen from 2 million people in 1950 to 11 million people in 2009. With the current birth rate there will be 50 million people by 2050, almost a 5-fold increase in just 40 years. This growing population in one of the world's poorest countries will face desertification and lower rainfall. So giving women control over their own reproduction and empowering them in their families and communities is not just fundamentally right, but will also help in the fight against climate change. Those countries, recognized by the UNFCCC as the most vulnerable, are least developed countries, small island developing states, and Africa. Many countries fall into not just one, but 2, and sometimes even 3 of these categories. So DFID must be alert to climate change as a fact of life in all of its poverty reduction work. The test of any spending will be, does this reduce poverty effectively? And an integral, crucial part of that test will be, does this spending take into account its environmental context and impact? Aid can only be called truly effective if it is climate smart, if it takes into account environmental considerations and impacts. And let us take a broader economic perspective. Aid can work miracles when it is effective, but it is ultimately wealth creation that allows poor people to lift themselves out of poverty. Wealth creation, harnessing the spirit of businesses and entrepreneurs to drive development, will be central to our international development policies. Economic growth is the only sustainable route out of poverty, and in itself helps countries be more resilient to the effects of climate change. But we must go further. A growth which is not green is not sustainable. In the same way that a low-carbon economy is good for Britain, so low-carbon growth abroad is a positive goal to work towards. Many developing countries have leapfrogged landlines and moved directly to mobile phones. This has been driven by new technologies and by the market. We now need to help find ways to encourage private companies to help poor countries leapfrog carbon-intensive energy production and move directly to low-carbon technologies. There is much that we can do to help promote low-carbon growth and to help spread new technologies. But we should first do no harm. Unfortunately, under Labour, British taxpayers' money is being used to subsidise dirty fossil fuel power stations. This brings me to my fourth key point. It is scandalous that now the world has woken up to the threat of climate change, Labour ministers are using taxpayers' money to guarantee unsustainable energy projects that are contributing to global warming. Figures from the Department of Business, Innovation and Skills reveal that the Export Credit Guarantee Department is providing approximately £750 million worth of support to fossil fuel projects. What's more, according to the National Audit Office, since 2000, ECGD has not rejected a single application for support on the grounds that it did not meet minimum environmental and social standards. This has got to change. We will bring to an end Labour's guarantees for dirty fossil fuel power stations. And today I can announce that under a Conservative government, ECGD will never again support investment in dirty fossil fuel power stations. We will take bold, unilateral action. This will send a message to the rest of the world that we are ready to lead from the front on ending environmentally harmful subsidies. It will be a priority at the OECD Export Credit Group and the other multilateral fora to press for other countries and their export credit agencies to follow our lead. This will be the basis of my party's position when the OECD Common Approaches is next reviewed in 2010. And we can go further. Our vision is that the UKTI and ECGD should become a champion for British companies that develop and export innovative green technologies around the world. The potential here is huge. If we take action in the right way, we can help cut carbon emissions while boosting economic growth in developing countries. Professor Vijay Modi of Columbia University has shown that solar power and other green technologies are highly viable and beneficial for developing countries because they can be much cheaper sources of energy than their current energy generation capacity, and because they sync so well with existing liquid petroleum energy generation. However, government guarantees are needed to catalyse private sector investment in this area because of the risk associated with large-scale projects in developing countries. This will not only help boost economic development in poor countries, because cheaper energy will be made available, it will also reduce emissions. And it would help British companies to take advantage of a rapidly growing market that could be worth billions of pounds in the future, creating jobs and wealth here at home. At the moment, this is a market we are missing out on. According to government figures, the UK has less than a 5% share of the global market for green goods and technologies. These government figures also show that the market shares achieved by Germany and France, normalised to their GDP, are around 50% higher than the UK share. Given that the world market for green technologies is expected to be worth billions of pounds in the years ahead, we can and must do better. So a Conservative government will make UKTI and ECGD much more proactive in encouraging British companies to invest in international green technology projects. And a Conservative Trade Minister working jointly between the Department for Business, Innovation and Skills and the Department for International Development will work as a priority to ensure that when opportunities for exporters arise in markets where ECGD support is relevant, ECGD is more than ready to support British companies in investing in green technology projects around the world. In his speech on Wednesday to the Green Alliance, William Hague will say more about supporting technology development and transfer in developing countries. The prize is great: a boost to poverty reduction and support towards a path of low-carbon economic growth. And going forward, I'm keen to explore new ways of using UKTI and ECGD to promote poverty-reducing, job-creating investment in the poorest countries. there is real potential for using taxpayer guarantees to encourage British business to invest in the countries which need foreign direct investment the most, particularly during the current crisis, which has seen global investment flows fall substantially. For the sake of our future prosperity, we must wean ourselves off our dependence on fossil fuels and set our economies on a low-carbon development path. Yet currently, much of the world's fossil fuel production and consumption is actually subsidized by governments. A recent report from the United Nations Environment Programme estimated that fossil fuel subsidies worldwide, largely in non-OECD countries, amount to around $300 billion a year. The OECD estimates that removing these subsidies could reduce global greenhouse gases by over 10%. These subsidies are, in the vast majority of cases, economically illiterate, developmentally questionable, and environmentally perverse. They're a clear reminder that government failure, as well as market failure, poses real risks to the environment. Protecting the poor from high energy prices is often the justification for fuel consumption subsidies. Yet we know that fuel subsidies are almost invariably badly targeted. Isn't it scandalous that according to an IMF review, on average, over 80% of the benefits of fuel subsidies in developing countries go to richer people? And when oil prices rise, governments in many developing countries struggle to contain the rising costs of maintaining fuel subsidies. A much better way to protect the poor is to eliminate fuel subsidies and allocate some of the savings to well-targeted poverty reduction programs and social safety nets. When the government of Indonesia implemented a subsidy reform program in October 2005, it put in place an ambitious cash transfer scheme targeting 15.5 million poor and near-poor households, some 28% of the population. The cash transfers more than compensated for the resulting fuel price increases and prevented an increase in poverty due to the price increase. Prior to reform, total subsidies in Indonesia had been higher than the health and education budgets combined. And similarly in Ghana, when the government accepted that, one, it could not maintain its policy of subsidizing petroleum products, and two, that the price subsidies most benefited the better off, it liberalized fuel prices while eliminating school fees at government-run primary and junior secondary schools and implementing a program to improve public transport. Such best practice should be applauded and disseminated worldwide. As well as providing a source of revenue for more effective social welfare systems, the savings from scrapping inefficient fuel subsidies can free up money for investment in clean water, schools, healthcare, and renewable energy infrastructure. The British government has said little on the reduction of fossil fuel subsidies as part of a post-2012 agreement. I would like to see G20 countries take the lead and phase out fossil fuel subsidies in 5 years, and for others to end subsidies by 2020. If we are to reduce global carbon emissions and achieve the Millennium Development Goals, real action needs to be taken on the progressive reduction of subsidies and market distortions. I believe that subsidy reform is a key element of our response to the huge economic, environmental, and social challenges of the coming years, and should be at the top of the diplomatic agenda. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, my 6th point. Rich countries must take steps to help give the poorest countries a bigger voice in global climate negotiations. If at the Poznan summit last year, as I did, you went for a walk around this gathering of the 192-member United Nations, you would have seen far fewer people from the world's poorest countries than you would have expected. The small Pacific island state, Kiribati, is expected to be the first country in which land territory disappears due to rising sea levels. Yet at Poznan, the Kiribati delegation numbered only 3 representatives, while the US delegation had over 80. Due to the size of their administrations, their limited capacity for crucial preparation, and the impossibility of affording the legions of expert lawyers and negotiators that the industrialized countries can bring to negotiations, the least developed countries and small island developing states lack the diplomatic clout to have much of an influence on global climate policy. Some even find themselves asking representatives from local NGOs who have been lobbying them to cross over and join their official delegations. It's time we shifted more control from the powerful to the powerless, because if they don't have a seat at the table, they're not going to be part of a fair deal. And that is why my party has called on the government to explore ways to ensure their voices are heard, for example, through an advocacy fund to help the very poorest developing countries take part in international negotiations. And climate change negotiations won't simply stop with an agreement at Copenhagen. There will be a plethora of implementation meetings for years to come. Lessons could be learnt from the EU's TradeCom facility programme, which provides significant capacity building, support for African, Caribbean and Pacific countries for effective participation in international trade negotiations. I would like to see agreement at Copenhagen for the UK to explore with our international partners ways to offer more support, for example, perhaps through establishing an international version of the TradeCom facility, a UN ClimateCom facility, as it were. As we look beyond the financial crisis, there is, ladies and gentlemen, a triple challenge facing every country. The task of rebuilding our economies will be tied up with the need to strengthen our societies and to tackle climate change. Copenhagen is a chance to do all of these, to go the way of a new global low-carbon economy, to entrench the opportunities for the developing world to participate in that economy, and to keep global warming below 2 degrees. Everyone in the world looks to our representatives in Copenhagen in December to reach an agreement that will come to be looked upon as a turning point for the future of our world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. A 6-point plan, very clear commitments on a whole number of priorities going forward, including climate smart aid and greening of the export credit guarantee facility. I'm going to offer the opportunity for 2 or 3 questions. We'll take them together. Andrew will take those. And then, as I said, we will break for an informal discussion where you'll have an opportunity to ask some more questions of the whole international development team that's present. OK, first off, Sam there, Dirk behind, and one this side. Sam.
Thank you. I'm Sam Bickersteth from Oxfam. Thank you very much for your statement, Mr. Mitchell, and there's some stuff that Oxfam strongly supports, particularly about the reform of the export credit guarantee and voice for developing countries in the negotiations. But I'd like to build on your statement about the additional cost of adapting and mitigating climate change. Oxfam's identified that $150 billion would be required for developing countries to adapt and mitigate on top of the 0.7 of national income as aid, which you've reaffirmed your party's commitment to. So if a Conservative government were in power, would it commit to finding additional funds to enable poor countries to adapt and to climate change? Thank you.
Thanks very much. Behind, Dirk, right in the corner. I'm sorry, I've only got room for it, but you could ask afterwards.
Leo Bryant from Maurice Stopes International. I was very encouraged to hear your emphasis on women's empowerment within the climate change adaptation agenda, especially in light of UNFPA's recent report. Do you envisage reproductive health being integrated into adaptation strategies, or kept separate as a health sector initiative? And can we take it from your support for the role of reproductive health in adaptation that the Conservative government will be increasing earmarked funding for reproductive health? Thank you.
Thank you, very good. There's a question over here.
Thank you. Estelle Roux for Action for Global Climate Community. I just have a question concerning the Conservatives' policies, if elected, on climate change and development for emerging countries such as China and India, but not as part as the international negotiation, but more as part of the bilateral cooperation between the UK and these countries, and also as the UK within the EU. Thank you.
So your question is what precisely?
I mean, what is the Conservatives' view on the relationship that the UK should have with emerging countries such as India and China, but also what is the UK's policy within the EU towards these countries?
You've got a very small...
Right.
Are you only going to take three?
No,
I've got
it's
one
not.
very, very
Yeah,
small
sure.
addition. Can you just pass the...
Thank you. The
Thank you,
name is Alice Ukoko, and I represent Women of Africa. The problem that African women have had over the 500 years to redeem Africa from poverty is that the British government is actually supporting, or appears to be supporting, corrupt governments in Africa. And would an incoming Conservative government now be prepared to work with African women to find ways to end the dependency of African countries and the corruption that is now raving the continent?
Thank you very much. Andrew.
Okay. Well, Alison, thank you very much for the opportunity to answer those four questions, which I think I will do in reverse order. Can I just say that afterwards, I do hope we'll be able to have a reasonably lengthy chat over coffee and explore some of the themes which I've set out in my speech today. On the question about Women for Africa, you raise an extremely good point about how do you work with governments that are corrupt. And as I'll say in response to the third question, the issue here is how you ensure that very poor people don't lose out twice over. Once because the international community turns their back on them because they have corrupt leaders, and secondly because they're very poor. And the example, you can imagine an example where a government behaved badly in terms of human rights or corruption, and there was pressure for Britain to withdraw its aid programme, and that the development community would be very aware that by withdrawing the programme, you particularly targeted little girls who were not then able to get into school because that support had been reduced. So it is a complex issue about how you work with corrupt governments without this double jeopardy for the people you're trying to help. In terms of working with African women, it is a key tenet of our Green Paper that we want to build up civic society. And, you know, it's sometimes seen as very difficult. I remember President Museveni saying to me, your support for civic society effectively goes through to my political opponents. And having to explain to President Museveni that, you know, building the political space for your oppositions is part of a successful free country, and that it's not about the politics of oppositionism, as he sees it, but it's about holding politicians to account. We've seen that this year in Britain. So building up civic society while understanding that being more robust, perhaps, than Labour is about complaining about governments that misuse our aid, being willing ultimately to remove that aid if they don't behave properly, but understanding how this can affect, in my example, getting little girls into school, is an important part of that equation. On the question about our bilateral relationship, I announced last year at the party conference that we would not be giving aid to China. Conservative government would stop it as fast as we practically could. Last year we gave between 50 and 60 million pounds of aid to China. I think this is a country that has just spent $2 billion on the Olympics, which has a space program, has its own aid program. I think that it is clearly right that the British taxpayer should not be supporting China in that way. Partnership, of course, working together with China closely in pursuing our common aims in development, that is right, but not giving China British taxpayers money. India is a different question. First of all, because there are more poor people in India than there are in the whole of sub-Saharan Africa. Secondly, because the average income of an Indian is 2/3 of the average income of a Chinese. And thirdly, because we have these deep historic roots with India through the Commonwealth and the period before the Commonwealth. So I think India is in a different category. But what we have said is that we will set up an immediate review of the 102 countries which DFID is currently, and that feels like us to be too many, too much of a scattergun approach. And we will look at those 102 countries and decide after that which countries we think we should be in. In terms of the relationship with the European Union, which you mentioned, we're after value for money. The same strictures that we impose on ourselves and on DFID about getting value for money and having independent evaluation to demonstrate not only to taxpayers but also to the poor in the countries we're trying to help that this money is indeed being spent effectively would apply to all the multilateral agencies, including the European Union. And the final point, I think, behind your question was this issue of the way in which money is channeled through bilaterally. I think we would do less budget support than the current government does. We understand that budget support is the best way of doing development if you can trust the governments with which you are dealing. We would certainly do budget support, I think, in Ghana and Rwanda. I think the position in Tanzania is very problematic, where we spent more than £120 million of British taxpayers' money last year. So we will not be quite so willing to go down the route of budget support as the current government is. A quarter of the bilateral programme goes through budget support, and we'll want to look very closely at that. Brian, Mary Stopes, whose work I'm familiar with around the world, most recently in Ethiopia. You asked me about the importance of the issue of population, where I had a passage in my speech which very clearly set out why it is so important. Conservative government, I can assure you, will place this very high indeed on our development agenda. It's critical for development, and it's critical also for climate change. It is tricky. I asked the president of Rwanda when we were there in the summer why he didn't do more to make the point about population. When you have a rising population of 5 or 6% and you manage to achieve growth of 5 or 6%, of course you wipe that growth out effectively by having such high rates of population increase. And he made the point that when he had suggested in his country that people should limit families to 4 children, there had nearly been a riot in the streets of Kigali, and that it was the most controversial speech he had made during recent years. He wants eventually to try and persuade his fellow countrymen to go down to 2 children per family. He's on the case, but he makes it clear how difficult it is, and we want to support enlightened leaders like him in this area to do what is clearly right. You asked whether a Conservative government would increasingly earmark funding for reproductive health, and the answer is consistent with what I've just said, that we would look very carefully at ratcheting this issue up the agenda for the reasons which you and I'm sure everyone in this room is very, very familiar with. Finally, the first question about the funding. Thank you for your remarks about ECGD. I think that it's irritating for people not to have cast-down figures on the table. But I think it is right, as my colleagues have said, that we should wait and see what comes out of Copenhagen. Depending upon what comes out of Copenhagen, we will be very clear indeed about what we want to do. We set out what we want to see agreed at Copenhagen, and I don't think it's very helpful for me to get into a hypothetical discussion about what happens if various different scenarios come to pass. But we made it very clear that we want to see additional funding for adaptation and mitigation. I'm sometimes asked whether or not the Labour figure of 10% of development spending, which you'll be familiar with, is the right figure. And it may well be the right figure. Indeed, if you look at the European Union proposal, the 10% figure in a year or two's time would be very close to the British commitment under that proposal. So it may well be that that is the right answer. But I prefer to rest upon the words of Cardinal Newman, where he says, O Lord, I do not ask the distant shore to see, one step enough for me. Let us see what comes out of Copenhagen, and then I'm sure we will be able to say the sort of things, just as I have today with ECGD, which Oxfam will think are sensible and right.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you all very much. We'll now, I'm going to close the formal questions on the record now. Now's the opportunity for you to have a coffee, mingle. There are a number of members of Andrew's team here. He's able to stay for 20, 30 minutes. Coffee is served next door, is that right, Liam? Please help yourself if you're able to stay. But let me just finish up by saying thank you very much indeed for coming this morning. I think that's been an incredibly inspiring way to start the week. And thank you very much to Andrew for choosing ODI to make your announcement this week. Thank you.